morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. My guest today is New York Times bestselling author J. Ryan Stradal, whose latest novel, Saturday Night at the Lakeside Supper Club, will be published April 18th. Jay, welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Charlie.
So Saturday Night at the Lakeside Supper Club is your third novel. It comes on the heels of two very successful books. How do you approach a new project? Do you say, hey, what worked before? Let me build on that. Do you try to set out in a new direction? How does it begin for you?
Wow, such a great question. I usually sit down and ask myself three questions, and they're, what do I want to learn more about? What am I afraid of? And what do I want to see more of in the world? And from there, I come up with an ending, and then I work backwards from the ending. I figure if I know my ending, I have a pretty good idea of what my themes are going to be. And once I lock those into place, the characters that can be equipped to work within those themes and explicate them develop. And then I sit on the characters for a while in my head until they start talking to me, and then I start writing scenes with them. I'll usually write a scene that ends up somewhere in the middle of the book first. I write the book out of order. I tend not to write at the beginning and go forward, but that all adds up to a pretty lengthy process. It took me 3.5 years to write my last two books a piece. Whereas my first book, which I'd outlined a bit more and had a more ironclad strategy going in, only took me a year to write. So with this fourth book I'm trying to write now, I'm doing more outlining at the beginning than I had done for either of my second or third novel. But I got to admit, Charlie, when I sit down and write, I feel like I'm writing my first novel all over again. I feel like I haven't learned a thing. I sit down and look at document one on Microsoft Word, blank page, and I go, okay, well, now what the hell do I do? Like I try to summon any of the old tricks that I thought of to write short stories when I was a younger writer and only wrote short stories. Like, think of like I'd open with a sentence that's an argument that's difficult to defend, or or something that sounds puzzling that I'm going to have to explain. Like, for example, like the first line of my first novel was Lars Torvald loved two women. And I thought, oh, okay, that's a fun place to start, because as I explicate that, his story will emerge. But that's also a first sentence that, okay, you're going to have certain assumptions about this guy based on that first sentence that I'm steadily going to disabuse. He ends up being like the most morally incorruptible character in the book. So to introduce him with this implication of bigamy is goofy-footed. But that was the kind of bag of tricks I used to pull from when I'd start writing novels or stories, and a little less reliant on that now, but I'll fall back on it if I have to.
Yeah, I love what you talk about the blank page. I often feel that the one great advantage that computer users have over the old days of the typewriter is that we only have to look at that blank page once instead of every 250 words.
That's true. That's true. That's true. You don't have a whole box of blank pages staring at you in the room.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've been called the king of the midwestern novel. Tell us about the role that setting plays in your novel and the setting of the American Midwest in particular.
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm the king of anything, not even my own house. I think my 3-year-old lays claim to that. But I really love the Midwestern setting. And as a young reader, I was very hungry for it. I wanted to see more representations in the Midwest, and Minnesota in particular, in the novels I was reading. I just didn't encounter a lot of those novels. So when I became a writer, and I thought, well, I've always been a writer, but when I started writing books on the publishable side of my skill level, when I developed my skill enough that other people wanted to read my books or read what I was writing, I thought, this midwestern setting is really unrepresented still, or underrepresented. I don't want to say it's unrepresented. Obviously, there's scores of wonderful midwestern writers, certainly more than I was aware of when I was a young reader in the 80s and 90s. So I feel like, oh, good, I don't have to speak for this region. I'm adding to a conversation that's been going a long time, and it's been is now as robust as I feel it's ever been. But that said, I still feel like where I'm from is a bit of an underdog, and sometimes misrepresented, often ignored. And well, when I think about where to set a book and where to set the characters, my mom also comes to mind. She's who I write my books for, and she was born in Fargo, North Dakota, lived her entire life in the northern Midwest. And, quite frankly, if I'm writing for her and I'm writing about her and people like her, that's where they're going to have to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I live in North Carolina, which is
cool.
typically considered to be in the South. And I've had a lot of discussion with other Southern writers, other North Carolina writers about sort of the difference between a person who writes novels that are set in North Carolina or that are set in the South versus a person who writes Southern novels or North Carolina novels. Do you think there's something that makes something a Minnesota novel or a Midwestern novel as opposed to just a novel that happens to be set in that particular place?
The characters. Yeah, the characters' attitudes and values in the setting. If they reflect attitudes and values typical of that setting at that time, and or challenge those typical attitudes and settings. If they're in any way in conversation with how Midwesterners see themselves and have seen themselves, and how they see the people they love and the people they interact with every day, then I think that's what makes it a Midwestern novel as opposed to just one set in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could set Die Hard in Minneapolis, and that doesn't make it a Minnesotan book. That's a great example, like a plot-driven novel where the setting is kind of secondary.
Yeah.
But if you have a character-driven novel, novel that I guess more traditionally has fallen in the upmarket or literary realms of fiction, then you could say, I think, with a bit more honesty, this is a Midwestern novel because of the attitudes of these characters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would you say that's true of Southern novels as well? Would you say
yeah, I mean, I think
character-driven ones?
I get different answers from different people. A lot of people say that it has to do with the relationship between the character and the land.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
That's a big element. Well, so you talk about character-driven novels, and to me, this Saturday night at the Lakeside Supper Club is a character-driven novel. Tell us a little bit, without giving away too much. Tell us a little about a novel and its main characters.
Yeah. Saturday Night at the Lakeside Supper Club is the story of two restaurant families. One is the Prager family. They own a chain of diners, kind of modeled on Perkins, Bob Evans, Denny's, that kind of thing, that in the history of this novel's narrative began as a independently owned single restaurant on Highway 61, southeastern Minnesota, that success engendered into a franchise covering over a dozen states and hundreds of locations. So the main character we follow in the Prager family is Ned, who is the grandson of the founder. And he's a nice guy. He's got a big heart. He doesn't really have a head for business, but he's a good people person. Yeah. And he finds himself as the oldest son of the current CEO and president, the heir to this empire. And he's got mixed feelings about it because he doesn't really feel that he's best equipped for it, but it's nonetheless expected of him. And he meets and marries a woman named Mariel. Mariel is the granddaughter of one of the original owners of the Lakeside Supper Club, which is family-owned, one location only restaurant in northern Minnesota. And unlike Ned, Mariel has very enthusiastically accepted her birthright and somewhat has hewn her identity to the stake of this supper club. She's there almost every day, and she's the load-bearing wall. She and Ned have friends and relatives that come and go. They have children, but they're the center of the book. These two scions of restaurant families, these two grandchildren of restaurant founders. And through them, they argue within themselves, within their family and friend units about the direction of Ned's franchise and Muriel's restaurant and which ones are viable long term and how would that make it out and how would that happen? Um, and having children is a big part of that. And when they have children, they think about which path is our child going to take. They come to feel that they're mutually exclusive, that you can't own and operate a supper club effectively and run a successful franchise of homestyle diners, which is probably true. You probably one of those two would be compromised. So I get to contrast different values of how Americans eat, particularly in the Midwest. I get to talk about concerns around legacy, ideas and concepts of what we expect of the next generation and how much of our own values are incorporated into that expectation. As a new father, I became a dad for the first time in December 2019 while I was writing this book. And yeah, that certainly recalibrated a lot of my notions of legacy and thinking about what my hopes and dreams are for this child and how his hopes and dreams may have nothing to do with those. And while interviewing supper club owners for this novel, I found, there wasn't always enthusiasm from generation to generation over the idea of running a restaurant that they were expected to work in for cheap or for free from a young age. So I wanted to put that in as well, that, hey, not every generation is totally jazzed about their birthright. And the inherent drama that comes with that, I thought this could make it a good novel. All of these, all of these various conflicts and schemes and family members.
So, obviously you've used the term supper club several times, which is not a term I had heard before I saw the title of this book. Tell us what a supper club is. What's the culture of the supper club?
Can I have one of my characters describe it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, this is how Mariel puts it. She's the owner at the time we meet her at the beginning of the book. She says this: every summer weekend, the horseshoe-shaped bar and its wood-paneled lounge were packed with people fresh from fishing boats and softball games and cars that had driven up from the cities. The supper club was a place where people chose to be on the most memorable nights of their lives, and it was a pleasure to be at the center of it all. On Mariel's watch, a proper supper club meal began with a free relish tray and basket of bread, with a round of brandy old-fashions, and then a lavish amount of hearty cuisine, with fish on Fridays, prime rib on Saturdays, and grasshoppers for dessert. So she gets right at the heart of what I think makes a supper club different than most restaurants. Mm-hmm. Is that when you sit down, you immediately get a plate of free food. You're treated like a guest in someone's home as opposed to a customer in a transactional relationship. And that sets the tone. You're also given more food than you should be able to eat in one sitting. The idea is that you'll take it home and it's a good value. Supper club meals are usually a bit more expensive than the typical meal in their area, since they're often rural or in their vacation destinations. They're rarely in cities. Very typically, the supper club is in a somewhat isolated location that could be a little hard to get to for outsiders, but nonetheless is a magnet for its community and becomes a third space in a profound way for its community. Place outside of work or home where people can get together and see their neighbors and their friends and stay as long as they like. And historically, there's been live music and entertainment and dancing at supper clubs. Less so these days. Some still do that, but they're usually the ones that have survived are in buildings long enough to revive buildings large enough to revive that idea should they want to reconstitute the supper club as a entertainment complex and not merely a dining destination. So yeah, I see supper clubs as one of the more inclusive versions of a restaurant I've experienced, and one of the more community-based in terms of its relationship and place within its community, since they're almost always invariably owned by since they're almost always owned by a local family and operated by that local family. You've got an extremely high chance of meeting the supper club owner behind the bar, or if you wander into the kitchen, seeing him or her there. So that already positions the supper club in a more intimate way than a typical restaurant does within the confines of its community. So that's why I wanted to write about them. I grew up in a smallish town in southeastern Minnesota where there were at least three within a 20-minute drive. And I worked in one as a teenager, and that also fueled my desire to write about them someday.
You talk about the supper club being inclusive, but this community in the novel, there is also an establishment that I would call exclusive. There's this sort of high end lake resort place with the fancy restaurant. Talk about how you kind of contrast those two different establishments and what that tells us about the kind of the nature of this community.
Right. Yeah, the lake country of northern Minnesota went through a pretty profound evolution in the early 20th century. There were resorts up there. I mentioned one in Reamer, Minnesota, that was kind of a getaway for Al Capone and his crew.
Yeah.
So there were some Tony resorts that catered to that set, but there had to be stuff for the regular family as well. And that's where the supper club comes in. The supper club emerged out of Prohibition as a family restaurant, but since they also had full bars, they were places where adults could go to celebrate an anniversary or um, a promotion or just a great day of fishing and have a few drinks and chum around with other adults. So, yeah, I wanted that contrast to just sort of illustrate the breadth of destinations and lifestyles that existed in Minnesota then and now, since there are still high-end resorts in northern Minnesota and more accessible, cabins by the lake, sort of setups in campgrounds. There's a real socioeconomic strata that, or a wide cross section of socioeconomic strata that have visited and still visit northern Minnesota in the summertime, and there's something for everybody. So contrasting the supper club against that, I felt like positions the supper club as the more accessible
Mhm.
and welcoming and affordable option, and which it is for most.
So we begin the novel. You alternate through different time periods, which is something I've done in my novels. I always enjoy that. And we start out going back and forth a little bit between Mariel and her mom Florence, when her mom is a child. But when we first meet Mariel, one of the things I noticed was within the first few sentences, she mentions pine trees, sapsuckers, deer. Like she mentions all these elements of the natural world. Talk a little bit about her connection to the natural world and what role the nature plays in your novel in general.
Nature is really important to me. I grew up feeling really integrated with it. I have a father who was a hydrogeologist and worked outside quite a bit. I was descended from farmers on both sides, and one of the things that makes Minnesota special to me is its natural environment. And northern Minnesota in particular is pretty special. It was a place where my family and I went on vacation quite a bit growing up, usually on the lower end of the economic totem pole, more camping, tent camping and cabins without running water as opposed to the expensive lodges of Al Capone. But nonetheless, that environment, um, the North Woods of Minnesota, really, really resonated with me and resonate with me today. It's a pretty special place, and I just tried to do it justice in the book. I wanted to create characters that had a relationship with it, that didn't take it for granted, that noticed small changes in their environment and were attuned to them. Mariel in particular, and I'd say her daughter Julia even more so, have a relationship with the natural world. Yeah, it's important to me, and it's something that in a book about restaurants, I didn't want to ignore. When you go back to setting and the importance of setting and deciding what subgenre a novel might be in, if this is a truly midwestern novel, I wanted to lean into that even farther by talking about the environment that these restaurants were in. and not just the restaurants themselves as shorthand for Minnesota, but the Minnesota that existed before these restaurants and will exist for thousands of years after. The pine trees, the lakes, the insects, the birds. That's the realm in which these people thrive and suffer and change. And I want to call attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things about creating characters is we're always writing about people who are different from ourselves. I, for instance, have never had a problem with writers who write across gender. I've had female protagonists in my books. But one of the things I find the most difficult is not writing across gender, but across age gaps, writing a character who's especially much younger than myself. And when we first meet Florence, I think she's 12 years old. It's the 1930s. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge of sort of getting into the head of any character who's different from you, but especially in the case of someone who's much younger? How do you get in that headspace?
Well, with Florence at age 12, I tried to put myself in the headspace of where I was when I was 12 and how I wanted to be perceived. I felt like I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted to be grown up. I couldn't wait to be a teenager and an adult. I didn't want to be 12. And I decided to make Florence like me in that regard, to make it a little easier to write a 12-year-old. I didn't want to write a 12-year-old who was leaning really hard into being a child, but rather one that didn't want to be a child, didn't consider herself a child, but nonetheless would still display childish behavior when it suited her. When when it was a card she could deal to affect a certain outcome. I wasn't above that. And so balancing that kind of immaturity with savviness, with thinking you're smarter than you are, but nonetheless want to be treated with respect to one's intelligence. Yeah, I did my best to catalyze all those into 12-year-old Florence. Looking back on my childhood, it certainly wasn't as rough as Florence's. So I did have some research to do there in terms of, what kinds of things would she have encountered, or what kind of compromises would have been visited on her? How would that affect her point of view? But in terms of thinking about a 12-year-old, I just tried to write from a place of great love and respect for them. And generally, when I write across age or gender, that's the main tool I use. I think, what's the best and perhaps most surprising way I can write about this person in a way that I can infuse with a lot of love and respect while I write them?
Ned's mom says something interesting at some point. I don't remember the exact phrase, but she sort of indicates a certain guilt about being wealthy.
Yeah.
And Ned obviously has some mixed feelings too about the success of this chain of restaurants, which its success has necessarily meant the failure of other restaurants that were there before that were not part of a chain. How does the whole idea of capitalism, and especially the notion that the goal of capitalism is to make as much money as possible, regardless of how you do it, how does that play into the novel?
Right. It plays pretty significantly into Ned's storyline. He starts to feel that the compromises that capitalism is forcing upon his family's business are no longer tenable. He doesn't find the restaurant to be as appealing as it was when it was a kid. He doesn't find the restaurant to be as appealing as it was when he was a child. He knows firsthand, actually, some of the compromises that have occurred in the name of growth. And he can't look past them in the way that his father or his sister can. So there are a lot of realms in life in which capitalism has a corrosive effect. Healthcare probably most prominently, but our entire vertical structure as it relates to food production and consumption is high up there too. Mm-hmm. The things we do to this planet and ourselves in the means of selling food for profit are a pretty tough pill to swallow. And Ned's in the midst of that. Ned has the wisdom and the insight to examine some of those crises in his own life. But unfortunately for him, he also has a stake a very personal and profound financial and emotional stake in the continued health of this capitalist restaurant franchise. So yeah, that's his dilemma, is how does he reconcile his knowledge that Jorby's isn't what it used to be, and it's only going to get worse, with he needs it to get worse to continue to make money.
Yeah. One of the things I really admire about this book and your other books is you do a great job of creating characters really quickly. Like a character walks onto the page and we feel like we know them without having to have page after page after page of exposition or even seeing them in action. What for you are the essentials of creating a character and doing it so that your reader, feels like they know that person is within a page or two of meeting them for the first time?
I try to put the character in a situation early that reveals what their boundaries are. And I try to do it in a surprising way. This wasn't the first way well, let me take a step back here. In my second novel, The Lager Queen of Minnesota, we meet Edith Magnuson when she's spotting an insect on the white trim of her windowsill, and she decides to nudge the insect outside into the grass. Like, she doesn't swat it, doesn't kill it, just wants it to move because she's afraid it's vulnerable there and it's going to get caught by a bird. And then she's racked with guilt that she's just ruined its vacation, that perhaps it wanted a break from the grass. And now she's gone and screwed it up. Yeah, I try to think of situations like that might be really subtle in terms of their physical action, but reveal the heart of these people. And yeah, throughout Supper Club, I tried to do the same thing. We meet Mariel when she's walking to the supper club, and she gets encountered by a neighbor who informs her that her mom is waiting to get picked, waiting for her to pick her up at church. We don't know anything about this relationship yet, but on the way to pick up her mother at church, Mariel hits a deer, and one of her first thoughts is, "I'm dead. Oh, well, now who's going to pick up my mom at church?" And I thought, okay, yeah, I know her now. Like, this is a person who's she's got a lot of plates spinning, She's just been besieged with responsibility her whole life. Like, even in death, she's responsible. Yeah. There's something going unattended because she's dead, and she feels guilty about that. I mean, ultimately, she meets a person within a couple pages that begins to absolve her of some of this guilt, thankfully. And her willingness to follow this person explicates some new aspects of Mariel's personality that I was delighted to pursue. But that said, when I introduce a character like Mariel or like Edith in my previous book, I want to show them at their most typical. Like, when they encounter a situation, what's a way they could describe it that no one else could? Or what's a conclusion they could come to internally that, makes me feel like, all right, I can draw other conclusions now based on this one. And the two examples I've given were my versions of that for these last two books. Yeah. It's so much fun to think of these situations. Like, that's one of my favorite parts of writing, is coming up with the initial conflicts that my characters encounter that draw out their personalities.
One reviewer that I read said of your book that the characters are fully realized, sometimes unlikable, but always as flawed and compelling as real people. The word flawed is the one that stuck out to me because, yeah, if we write characters who are perfect people, then they're not going to be very believable. Tell us a little bit about the flaws of Mariel and Ned in particular, maybe Florence as well.
Right. Yeah, Ned's flaws I've spoken to a bit earlier, in that he's born into a business that he doesn't have the head or the heart for.
Yeah.
And he knows it. And so he's wrestling with that conflict Mariel, I think, can be as stubborn as her mom. She's the kind of boss that isn't super good at delegating authority, kind of wants to do it herself. Like, I'll just do it myself, and as such, doesn't create time for her to process trauma. Like, she has a miscarriage early in the book and she thinks she's got to go back to work right away. I consider that line of thinking a flaw in Mariel's context, that she won't allow herself the space to grieve what for her is a loss and to recover from a physical and emotional body blow, literally. I feel like her encountering Brenda is part of what wakes her up from that. She almost is besieged by her level of responsibility to others that I'm not sure she perceives that other people don't necessarily expect from her. She's kind of overloaded with anxiety, and it expresses itself in ways that really corrode her from within. But that said, she's one of the kindest and most intelligent and sweetest people in the book, too.
Yeah.
Florence, however, yeah, is quite a bit more unlikable to a lot of readers. She's a character that was traumatized as a child, has developed a pretty oblique and self-centered coping mechanism or mechanisms around that. And as an adult is a pretty selfish and self-centered person. That said, one of my goals for writing the book was to demonstrate how people can change and what sort of situations can draw out the best from a person, even a person we might have dismissed as being a toxic narcissist. Who can like, are these people capable of redemption? That's a question I asked myself and setting Florence into motion.
Yeah, yeah. There's a moment early in the novel where Ned almost meets Mariel. He sees her. He's trying to decide whether he's going to chase her down, and then he just kind of he's convinced that she's the one, even though he's just sort of glimpsed her. And then a few months later, he happens upon her at the supper club. What role do you see the idea of fate playing in your novels, in fiction in general, in the world?
Oh, wow. I'm so glad you asked that question, Charlie. This is fun to answer because no one's asked this yet. In my mind, I don't want to put thoughts in the mind of the reader. I'm just another reader at this point. So this is just my opinion. In my opinion, he didn't see her 5 months before. That was somebody else. That nonetheless put this idea in motion that, oh, there's this ideal woman out there for him. And that's such something Ned would do. Like, any woman that's accessible to him easily, he's going to find a problem with it, or he's going to be too lily-levered to pursue. But someone who's this impossible ideal, oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. It'll keep him from actually getting around to doing anything positive in that realm, that dating in the meantime. It's his excuse. Like, I don't have to date. I've already met the perfect woman, and I don't know if I'll ever see her again. It gets him off the hook. So when he does see her again, he surprises himself at his initiative. He's like, well, there she is. He judges this woman based not on her appearance. He judges her on an action he believes she's done, an act of generosity towards a stranger. He thinks that's what I'm looking for in a person. And once 5 months have passed, and he realizes that I'm probably not going to easily encounter this person again. I think that projection of his really starts to calcify. So when he does see someone he believes to be her, which is Mariel, he thinks, oh, I better get her. Yeah. I better back my hopes and dreams up here, because if this is her, I can't let her get away again.
Yeah.
And their romance blossoms from there. And later in the book, there appears an awful lot of subjectivity around Ned's story. However, Ned is adamant that his version of the story is the correct one. Yeah. And I love that. I think it was an important lesson for him to have a goal that was his own, that he had to achieve of his own initiative and action that no one else could do for him. Because he was a guy that had everything handed to him from childhood. He certainly didn't have to work to have his position or wealth. So for him to idealize a woman, chase her, and earn her love was a tremendous boost of was a tremendous was a tremendous confidence booster for Ned.
Yeah.
And important for his development.
Yeah. One of the chapters early on with Florence, she's a child. She has an interaction with a man, and the last sentence of the chapter was, "It was hard to imagine that in time she would